Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Your Dose, where we speak to individuals with lived mental health experiences to hopefully make people feel less alone and more connected. And today we are speaking with couple Jake and Emily. Jake discusses his experience with antisocial personality disorder, homelessness, and how acting and writing have helped him manage his disorder. Emily discusses OCD and some of the unsettling themes she has experienced, such as harm towards others. We delve into the challenges of building a relationship while dealing with two very different mental health issues, and how they manage to overcome these obstacles. Together, they have founded Antisocial Theatre, which aims to decrease the stigma around less frequently discussed mental health disorders. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and thank you so much for listening. Hi guys, so we have Emily and Jake here today.
Hi.
Hello. How are you both?
Fine, thank
Very
you. How
well.
are you?
I'm good. A fellow northerner, or northerners, which is nice.
All Northerners.
Absolutely.
And you're in Manchester at the moment.
Yes, we're in Salford, Manchester, just outside. Yeah.
And how long have you been in Manchester now?
2 years.
It's coming up 2 years. Yeah, in September.
Yeah.
And do you enjoy it?
It's great.
I
Yeah.
love it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah, there's literally so many bars and restaurants and music events in Manchester. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Very good place. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, first of all. It's so nice to meet you both. As always, I think one of the best questions to start off with would be to learn. Obviously, I've never had a couple on the podcast before, so that's really interesting. But maybe individually to just explain to the listeners exactly what it is that you experience from a mental health perspective, and then we can sort of deep dive from there. So you guys can choose who goes first.
I'll go first.
Yeah, I can go first. Okay, yeah. So I suffer with antisocial personality disorder, and also traits of borderline personality disorder. I received my official diagnosis back in 2020, but this is something I've been suffering with probably all my life. And essentially, it's probably it's part of a cluster of disorders known as Cluster B personality disorders, and antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, gets a pretty bad rap because of the sort of the diagnostic criteria associated with it. So people, the most informal name that you will hear associated with it is the word sociopath. That's the typical
Really
sort of term that people use. Is usually used in sort of a derogatory and an unofficial term to describe people with ASPD. But essentially, it exists on a spectrum. So there is people who are at the severe end of the spectrum, people that are in and out of prison, really violent criminals. That does exist, and that's something that I do try and portray on our page, Antisocial Theatre, which is where we talk about all this kind of stuff. Because I think you need to be transparent if you're talking about these kinds of things. But essentially, I'm sort of sat in the middle. Like, it's a bit more mundane. Like, I suffer with like a lack of empathy and that kind of thing. So I'm able to cognitive empathy is something I have quite a lot of. So I'm able to understand why someone may feel a certain way, but I struggle with affective or emotional empathy. So I can't feel what they feel. So
So sorry, just to ask you a question then. So if Emily came to you and she'd had a really bad day and she said that she was upset and she explained the situation, you would be able to respond in the right way, but you wouldn't get it. Is that right? I'm a bit confused.
That's pretty much correct. Yeah, so it's like I'm able to understand why someone feels a certain way, and I'm able to act compassionately.
Right, that's interesting.
But I'm not able to feel the same thing typically. So
because isn't that slightly similar to autism in the way that the autistic people can't show empathy? Is that not similar?
I mean, people do draw similarities with things like autism. So yeah, I suppose I suppose I can see sort of a correlation there, but there's a lot more to ASPD in the package that sort of separates it from things like autism, like um, well, I don't want to say it sounds bad, but like being manipulative, being irritable,
Yeah.
impulsive, substance abuse disorder, that's often, paired with it. Things like homicidal ideation, that kind of thing. So it's a really dark disorder to deal with, but a lot of it's internalized. So you hear the term and you typically think of somebody going around and beating people up or smashing windows in, and
Yeah.
that does exist in some people with it. But for me, it's more like a very lonely lifestyle with not many friends. It's also a disorder birthed from trauma, so a lot of it comes from I was abused quite heavily as a child, and through my upbringing in school as well. Like I was homeless at 16, so I was constantly surrounded by violence and like having to survive. And I suppose that's where like the BPD traits come in, like being hyper vigilant of violence and having
Yeah.
to get away, but also longing for like a connection that I'm not able to feel. It's like a bit of a whirlwind, to be honest.
I'm shocked because I've never heard of this disorder before, which is surprising because I've been to university and studied psychology and I've never ever heard of this personality disorder. So I'm really intrigued to just, whilst we're with you, Jake, to just
Yeah,
dive a little bit deeper into this, if that's okay.
sure.
And then we'll move to Emily. So there's a few things really. So you mentioned that you this is effect you got diagnosed how many years ago?
It was back in 2020 I received my official diagnosis.
So
Yeah.
not that long ago, really. So how were you typically affected up until then? Like, what were the main symptoms that you
So
experienced?
yeah. So the main symptoms for me that so when it sort of reached its peak between the ages of like 16 and probably like 19, and I say reached its peak as in that's when I was at the worst point of my life. So I was homeless. So my family had kicked me out. I had nowhere to go. I was eating from food banks. So the people that I were involved with were also very damaged people.
Mm,
So my symptoms, one of the biggest symptoms that I still struggle with today, but even more so back then, was anger and rage. And I don't mean like being a bit irritable. I mean like rage. Like I was angry at the world, everything. I'd hated everything, absolutely everything that walked in my path. So I'd obviously abuse things like certain drugs and drink as well, and then I'd hang around with the wrong people, and we would probably, would be pretty violent to people together. Like you sort of you like feed off each other.
yeah.
I think what's that term, filet au deux or something.
Yeah.
Like a shared madness. I think that means. So like I fed off this person fed off me, and we were just we hated the world together. So we would be violent to other people, and we started to get like a sense of like power from it. Probably to fill in the void that was we were powerless in our own lives. So you sort of take it out on everybody else.
Wow.
And I was ready to do some pretty heinous things back then, and I did get in trouble with the police, and that kind of sort of woke me up a little bit. Like
Yeah.
I don't really want to be going down that path, so I just eventually I moved away from this person, and then those people, and became a little bit more socially isolated. And the certain symptoms, sort of diminish with age anyway. In a lot of in this case, but the certain symptoms that I still really struggle with today, like irritability, aggression, rage, the lack of empathy, that'll probably always be there till the day I die. But it's like it was more of a problem for other people back in that at that point, you know. But at the same time, like on paper, it's like, oh, he was just a criminal, or he was, But a lot of these things were all also internalized. Like I've also experienced like suicidal thoughts. I tried
Yeah.
to commit suicide when I was homeless at one point. So there's been a lot. It's not. Again, you hear the term sociopath, and people start using people's names like Ted Bundy and all these, people who watch a couple of crime dramas and they think they know everything about everything. And that's the whole reason we started Antisocial Theatre, was to get the word out
Reduce
that
the stigmatization,
exactly. It's people. There's a lot of people around you that will probably struggle with similar things, like borderline personality. I'm sure you've heard of. It's part of the same cluster. It's the same cluster of personality disorders. It's just, so there is overlapping symptoms. It's just slightly different, of course. So yeah.
So thank you for that. That was really interesting. If you feel comfortable talking about one of the topics that you just mentioned, so I'm intrigued a little bit about, because obviously you were homeless and you were clearly in like a really, really bad place, bad crowd, and it would be very easy for you still to be in that. So what was like the turning point, and what was the point of, obviously you said that you attempted suicide whilst homeless. Why, like, what was it that stopped you going through that? Was it just unsuccessful, or was there something that made that not happen? And also in terms of like the homeless side of things, what was the turning point? Was it the police, or was it something else?
So with the suicide, it was like, if I'm completely honest, it was probably a lack of education on how to do it, because you don't typically learn how to do those things. But yeah, I'd just basically taken like loads of sachets of paracetamol while I was drinking, and I ended up just vomiting it out anyway. So, but I was in such a state where I was really I really wanted to do it. It was like, and it, like something just clicked, and I was like, I just need to get out of here, and I just started it. But I don't. Again, I'm not medically trained, so I don't even know if that would have worked anyway. But it was the mindset. It was that I'm ready to do
that's
it.
what you think, don't you? Like take a load of pills and that'll hopefully work.
Yeah.
So back to the question of like the coming out of the homelessness. Was it the incident with the police that was the turning point?
So the turning point, as in to get me away from this person, to stop doing these things, was the police. As in, like, I thought to myself, so just for a bit of background, as I mentioned, my dad was extremely abusive. He went to prison for some really heinous acts, and ended up getting out really early, by the way. So that's the justice system for you. But so I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be him. Like, the reason I'm like this in the first place, and I was like that, I was a spitting image of him. Like, I didn't want to become like him. And I think that moment when I was sat in the cell, and I just thought, I can't do this. I can't be like him, because I'm just as bad. I'm just as bad as him. Like, if I do this, so the symptoms didn't change. Nothing really changed, but my perspective on where I wanted to be completely shifted. So at that point, I sort of patched things up with my family at the time, very loosely. I moved back in with them for a short period of time, because there was some guilt there on their side, apparently. And eventually I got my own place through the homeless hostel that I was sort of under. They helped me. They're called Rush House in Rotherham. Shout out to them. They really helped me out. They got me out of this situation. They got me a bed sit in Rotherham. So I managed to get out of that, and eventually, a few years later, moved to Manchester. So I eventually got away from all of it, all the bad stuff.
And still, what amazes me is this whole time you had no idea that you were dealing with quite serious mental health issue, and so you were dealing with all of this whilst not having a diagnosis. Is that correct?
Yeah, semi-correct. So like, I'd been in and out of therapy already since I was probably around 13. So even way before this, I was because I lived with just for a bit of just to clear it up a little bit. I realised I've not been entirely clear. So when I was 16, I was living in Rotherham, and I was living with before I was homeless, I was living with my mum and my stepdad, who we really didn't get along, and there was some violence things out there as well. But before that, like many years prior, we was living in Blackpool, and it was just my mum and my two older brothers, and we were sort of dealing with the aftermath at that point from a court case because of my dad and the stuff he'd done to us when we were younger and things like that. And then obviously we moved over to sort of to Manchester and sorry, to Rotherham.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was spoken to about things. So there's something before antisocial personality disorder called conduct disorder. So that's something that gets picked up on in childhood, typically before the age of like 15, 16. And even my mum today would tell me these things, and I'd think, oh my God, that makes so much sense. And she was telling me that when I was younger, that I was violent to all the children and like nurturing things like that. And I'd be like, I'd be knocking the beans out or pulling the hair and I'd bending the fingers back. I'd just be nasty, like,
Really?
because I'd
Yeah.
obviously picked that up from the house that I was living in. So I did have an inkling as to what was going on, and I actually did a dissertation. I did acting at college, and I managed to fit in like a psychology point of view for my dissertation, and I did study personality disorders, and that's what made me think I could have this. And then it was
It's interesting
corroborated later on.
that you decided to do that. Was there any reason why you decided to do the personality disorders at the time? Because you weren't fully aware that that's what you were experiencing.
So I had an inkling that this is
Yeah. Okay.
probably the most likely thing that fits everything that's been happening in my life at this point.
Yeah.
The only thing that really fit. And funnily enough, it came from hearing the term sociopath and psychopath. I heard those terms used at me many times over the years, and I thought maybe there's some truth to that. And then you Google those terms and you realise it's associated with antisocial personality disorder. You start reading, and I was thinking, oh my God, this is just me. I'm reading all these stories and all these symptoms, and I was thinking, this is just me. And when I spoke to the clinical psychiatrist, I gave her a bit of a background in my history, all that kind of stuff, and obviously they have your things on file anyway. And she corroborated the diagnosis, corroborated everything that I'd said and everything I'd done. So it was I gained a bit of like, I was like almost too self-aware. Like it's a bit of I said this on a previous podcast. It's a blessing and a curse to be so self-aware, because it's like you know what's going on, but you don't know how to change it because you can't really stop it from happening. You can just minimize the outcome.
So since the diagnosis, has your life changed in any way?
I would say so, yeah, and for the positive, because I got my diagnosis like a year or so into Antisocial Theatre, so like a year into the project of raising awareness about controversial mental health topics. So that really, I feel like that really gave me a footing, like a real like talking point and a real, because like I said, I thought this is what I could have. And then I became really educated on the topic, and then as soon as I got that diagnosis, I felt like, yeah, right, okay, I've got that confirmation now that I'm not just making things up and I'm not just thinking things that aren't there. I've got this confirmation from a psychiatrist, and now I can go on and tell other people in the world that, you're not destined to be in jail, you're not destined to be this and that, and you can do good things despite receiving that diagnosis. Like, it's not everything that you are. So
that's amazing. That's really amazing. I have a lot more things to ask you, but I appreciate that Emily's been sat there and she might want to speak. But thank you, Jake. That's honest. I find that so interesting. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but it is in an interesting story in a way. Like I've never heard of that disorder before, and I'm sure that a lot of people listening to this won't have heard of it. And so what you're doing is incredible, being an advocate for your disorder and making people just changing the stigma around it.
yeah.
You might, I'm sure narcissism is something that's probably a term that's thrown around in a similar way within that disorder. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you. So moving on to Emily now. What exactly is it that is your experience?
So for as long as I can remember, I've had problems with my mental health from a very young age, actually. I started off, I don't know how old I would have been, but I started off with emetophobia, so it was a phobia of being sick, and I was quite young when that happened. I can just remember being afraid of like being sick and other people being sick for as long as I can remember. So I was in and out of therapy when I was younger for it, but therapy when you're younger, I don't know, it wasn't very helpful for me. It was sort of a you'll grow out of it kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen. And then I remember I was 13, I think, at school, And I started to get therapy from an actual therapist, because I think I'd visited the doctors and it was still, I was unable to do anything out of my routine, because I thought that anything out of my routine would result in me being sick, or me getting like a sickness bug. That was like my main worries and concerns. So I started therapy for that. And then halfway through therapy for the emetophobia, I remember I was sat at a family party one day, and I just got this intrusive thought, this really horrible intrusive thought that I was a murderer, and that I wanted to harm people. And I had no idea what was going on. Obviously, like being 14 at the time when that happened, it's quite a scary thing to go through. So I sort of pushed it away and kept trying to just brush it under the carpet. I didn't want to think of it, kind of thing. And then I started to develop really bad intrusive thoughts, quite violent intrusive thoughts about my family members, people that were really close to me. And it became really debilitating in that instance. So I remember discussing it with my mum. And it turns out that my sister suffers with the same sort of thing.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I realised that I had OCD. And obviously my sister has OCD as well. So that is something that I am suffering with at the minute. I think I've probably suffered with it longer than I thought. I feel like the emetophobia was also partly OCD as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I did a podcast recently with a girl, and she also had the emetophobia, which I've never heard of before.
Yeah.
And she also has OCD. And a question around that is, when did it get to a point where you got help? Did your parents start to notice it, I'm assuming, or what happened?
Yeah, so I think when I was younger, I was sick a lot, just like vomiting a lot. And I think my mum told me that she was really concerned about that because she didn't think it was normal. So obviously I went and had checks done at the doctors and nothing came back. And I think they just did put it down to anxiety. So I've always been an anxious child, and this must have been when I was a toddler. But I remember when I was about 6 years old, I just couldn't stay at my grandparents' house. Like, it was sort of like a little ritual for us. Every week we'd stay at one or the other grandparents' house, either on my mum's side or the dad's side. And I just couldn't do that, because if I did that, I was sick. And obviously that, you know what, like phobias, as soon as you start engaging that behaviour, it just builds on top of each other, so you start avoiding it. So that was one of the things that I'd avoid. And then that turned into not even being able to go out anywhere on the weekends. That was outside of my routine. Just being afraid to go out anywhere, to stay at anyone's houses, so to go to like friends' birthday parties. Obviously, like when you're a child, and I think I remember like my mum would have to like almost drag me out of the house to make me go to like my grandparents, or make me go to a child's birthday party, like my best friend's birthdays, because I'd just be like, it'd be unbearable to be like to go. I'd be fine when I got there, but it was that build up of having to go. And I think that's when my mum sort of realised there wasn't something quite right. So that's when I went to the doctors and got my first bit of therapy, which wasn't too helpful at the time.
So in terms of, obviously, a question, you've kind of just partly answered my question. So I was going to ask, how did it affect you when it came to those events where you had to do things? And you mentioned that you were fine when you were there, but what sort of behaviours would you be engaging with before you got there? Do you remember?
It would literally be like running away from my mum and dad, like hiding, not wanting to go. I'd be crying. I'd cry to the point where I would actually throw up, which would then build on that behaviour again. And it would just be like immense amounts of anxiety. It got to the point where I think I developed some form of like separation anxiety towards my mum, because any time that she'd go out, I'd start to feel panicky and sick as well. So it was like not being able to go outside. I wouldn't like my mum going out either. And then I think I would start to develop that compulsive behaviour, so avoidance, which is something that I do now with my OCD. So I think maybe that's where it stems from. You kind of get that, what's the word, like reassurance from the compulsions with my emetophobia. And I also got that with my OCD as well. So I think it just sort of intertwines there.
Intertwines, yeah. So the thoughts of like the violent thoughts started at around 14?
14, I think I was, yeah. I remember the day. It was like something switched in my brain, and I've never been the same since.
Really?
Yeah, and it was so scary at the time, because obviously you're 14 years old, you wouldn't have those thoughts usually. And I just had no idea about it, so I didn't want to speak to anyone about it, because I was scared that I was going to go to jail, or scared that I'd be like put into a hospital, just scared of obviously people saying things to me, because it's not normal to have those thoughts, like really violent, intrusive thoughts that you can't even control. You know, I couldn't go to sleep at night because the thoughts would just come in. I couldn't eat anything. And then obviously my stomach would just be a mess because I wasn't eating. And I remember there was a brief period where I was just in bed all the time, not able to get up. It was just constant, like from the minute like I woke up in the morning, these intrusive thoughts would start, and I couldn't even sleep to get away from them. So for a long time after that, I think it was maybe a year or two after that, I'd have to sleep with the TV on and put it on a timer just because some noise in the background would drown out those thoughts.
Oh my God. And at that point, were your parents aware, I'm assuming, of what was going on?
Yeah, my mum's always been so supportive, and my dad as well. And obviously my sister having those thoughts, really, we help each other out still today. And they were really supportive, but obviously there's only so much that you can do for someone, because OCD it's torturous, really. Like there's just no escape from it until you start going to therapy, which I did have a little bit of therapy when I was about 16, 17 in college, but I was still really scared to talk about the thoughts. So I'd sort of try and numb the thoughts, dull the thoughts down so they didn't sound as bad, so I could get help without actually getting help. But then when I actually did go to therapy when I was 20, 21, I think, only a few years ago, that's when I actually received proper help for my OCD, and I actually started to be able to overcome it, I think.
Yeah, live life in a fairly normal way. In terms of the so was there any other like OCD themes that you experienced aside from the violent thoughts?
Yeah, so there was the violent thoughts, like there's always the sexual thoughts as well that people get, which is, I think, one of the hardest ones to deal with.
Would you mind talking a little bit about that? I know it's a bit of a weird topic to discuss, but I've actually never had that. I've had lots of people with OCD, but we've never touched on that. So if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, so it's a tough one, really. I think a lot of it is, especially like in a past relationship, sorry to talk about that, but especially in like a past relationship, one of the things that I would get would be like a relationship OCD, and it's the fear that you'd cheated on your partner, which is a really horrible thing to go through, obviously, because it's always sort of attacks your morals. It always attacks your morals. So it's those sexual thoughts, like intrusive thoughts that you don't want to have. Worried that you'd actually like cheated on your partner, like actually done it, and like sort of having false memories that had happened when it hadn't. And it's just like you sort of become a little bit, it's just hard to know what reality is and what's not. I think that's when you know that you're in sort of the bad stage with your OCD, is when you don't really know what is real and what isn't. But I think that's one of the hardest ones to deal with, because again, that also is a violent thought. It stems from like the violence of things. Worrying that you've like maybe abused someone. That's something which I don't really talk about because I find it so hard to talk about still. And obviously I think there's a massive stigma around that. Especially like I think I've been in like OCD forums before, and people have tried to talk about their sexual OCD and like abuse theme in OCD, and a lot of people infiltrate them comments and say awful things to them, which is very triggering for someone with OCD. And it's that lack of understanding. I think when you have that label OCD, it's just completely different to what it actually is. And I think because people don't know that, that's when it's so damaging for someone with OCD.
Yeah, because I think the biggest thing is like people just assume that people with OCD are really clean.
Yeah, like that's the main thing everyone goes to.
And it's so far away from that.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the compulsions that you would have associated with that, what are some examples that you might?
So when I first started, it was a really weird ritual that I'd have. So I'd have to clean behind my nails 5 times every night. But then it would start to get worse. It'd be 5 times. I'd have to do the whole thing 5 times. It'd be touching certain things in my room, or making sure that something in my room is in a specific place. Not because I want it to be neat and tidy, but because if I don't, I'll end up like harming my family or hurting someone that I really love. All these intrusive thoughts will come back. There's also the mental compulsions, people call them, and that's confession. So confession is a big one of mine. And it's one that I've always struggled with, because to other people it might seem like you're just talking about your OCD, but it's the confession, it's the non-stop talking about it, reassurance seeking is another one. Rumination, so it's just going over the same thing over and over again and sort of torturing yourself about it. I think it's the mental compulsions that I deal with now more than the physical ones. I found the physical ones easier to deal with, I think, than the mental ones.
So in terms of from the mental compulsion perspective, how do you manage that now on a daily basis? Obviously it still affects you, but is there anything that you do to like mitigate the symptoms?
It's not engaging in it as much as possible, and as hard as that is, it's having to surround yourself with people that understand your OCD. So obviously I let you know when I'm having issues with my OCD, and you know not to give me reassurance regarding it. So you can talk to me about the OCD, but you won't interact in something that would be reassuring to me, saying, no, you haven't done that, or no, you won't do that.
It would more be like, we're not talking about this?
No, it would just be more like accepting it. Well, if you have done this bad thing in the past, you can't change that now. So there's nothing that you can do. It's exposure therapy. I was
going to say that's the exposure therapy, isn't it? Yeah.
But it's talking about it and being supportive, which you're really good at and always there for me. But just not. A lot of the time, I've had friends before where I think they just sort of give you reassurance because it's an easy thing to sort of shut you up. But it's not the best thing for someone with OCD. And I do understand how tiring it is, but it's just surrounding yourself with people that understand what's good for your disorder and what isn't.
Thank you for that. I think what might be good now is, based on what we've just kind of been speaking about, will be to talk a little bit about you two and your relationship. First of all, how you met, and then go into a little bit how you manage the relationship based on the fact that you've both got very different mental health issues.
Yeah.
So first question, how did you meet?
Okay, so we both actually met at university. As I mentioned earlier, I was studying acting, like theatre acting, and Emily was doing videography. So, funnily enough, for one of the first pieces for Antisocial Theatre, where it all started, we needed a videographer to do all the video stuff, and then Emily came in, and the rest is history on that front, essentially.
Amazing. I love that story. We'll talk a little bit about Antisocial Theatre soon as well. Really intrigued to hear more about that. Sure. But from a relationship perspective, has there been any like moments where you've really struggled, and how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I would say mostly at more towards the beginning of the relationship, because well, to put it bluntly, Emily is more emotional and I'm not, like but not in the sense of, and just to clear something up as well while we're on this topic, is it's not that I cannot feel any emotion at all. That's one of the biggest like misconceptions there is. It's just that it's a lot more dulled, like a lot more sort of it's like I can feel emotion. It's just not, it only goes to a certain point, if that makes sense. Like I'm only able to feel
love, right? You can love Emily,
of course I
can, and so that's an emotion in itself, and
exactly.
Like one of the biggest emotions that you can feel. So I understand. It's just that there's only a certain amount that you can understand in terms of what someone's going through. So you can feel that feel love for someone else, but you can't really understand how they feel. Does that?
It's sort of. It's actually like, I didn't realize how complicated it is just like to explain it. But it's like it's essentially that I love in my own way is the way I describe it. It's like it's everyone, and everyone, even everyone who isn't disordered has their own way of obviously showing love and things like that. But because I'm so emotionally sort of null and like everything's sort of dull for me, it's like my brain doesn't sort of allow me to enjoy things. It doesn't allow me to have things without ruining it, or sort of being wary of it. So going back to your original question, because of that, Emily didn't really understand why I wasn't able to sort of facilitate the response that she needed. Maybe you could sort of talk a bit about that.
So I think coming back to like the OCD side of things and the reassurance, because at one point before I received help, that was such a big thing for me. I think having someone that needs constant reassurance, but you not understanding maybe why they need that constant reassurance. I think that obviously puts a barrier in the way.
Yeah.
But it's just like when we first got together, it's hard to understand because I'd never heard of antisocial personality disorder either. And I'm sure you didn't really know much about the OCD side of things.
No.
It's just sort of that getting to know each other's disorders as well. But I think for me, because I needed that reassurance, maybe you couldn't give me that as much at the beginning because we just sort of didn't understand each other. But I think as well as that, for me, especially when I have my OCD moments and my flare-ups, I feel like I become quite selfish in the sense that I need the reassurance, like, because I just need to feel safe straight away. And sometimes you don't understand that other people are going through their own disorders, and you sort of become, not intentionally, but quite selfish. And it's not understanding why you can't give me that right now. And it's not that there's anything wrong with me or there's anything wrong with you. It's just because we're different in the sense of our disorders, we just didn't understand each other just yet. I think is the best way to sort of put it on my side.
And is there anything that you've done in particular to try and understand each other, or has it just been like an overtime thing where you've naturally just learnt more about each other?
Yeah, I think it's more of an overtime thing, as you said. Like, we've sort of developed, and I think me and the one thing that I would credit us for is we're really good at just talking about things as they are. There is no, again, from my side, there's no sort of emotional response in terms of, like, I'm not going to get angry, or I'm not going to just blow up if she says something that she thinks I might not like. I'm quite good at just being like, right, okay, I'm just taking it on the chin, sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know? And because of that, Emily can basically say anything. And also as well, we've shared the darkest parts of our human experience with each other. You know, things we haven't spoken about in public settings, and we've shared those with each other and only each other. And with that comes a certain degree of trust and a certain development of a relationship in general. So I think it's just like I've learned, on my side, I've learned to trust, because I trust basically nobody. So the only person who I've learned to trust with those kinds of things is Emily, and I think that's probably helped.
Yeah, definitely.
That's lovely. Another question for you, Jake, that I've been just thinking about since we spoke before was around the anger side of things. And you said that was something that like you really, really struggled with, and you still actually struggle with today. Has that ever like affected your relationship at all? And if so, how do you manage that?
In terms of my actual aggression and anger, I don't think that's something that's ever really held a barrier in between us. I think, I don't. Maybe towards the beginning, when again I didn't really understand why she was saying, and
frustration probably more than anything, that you couldn't understand it.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it was. It was more a frustration thing at the beginning. But my aggression and rage, it's very specific. It's sort of like I think the more aware I've become, the more I realise it's to do with like insecurity than anything. So when you've gone through life being basically either physically abused or mentally abused by not only your family members, that people that's supposed to look after you, but the people who are meant to be friends with at school and things like that. When you're constantly being bombarded for like what I'm 27 this month, so like most of my life, you start to become like very, I don't know, like angry at everything and the world. So I think like my anger is more of a response to other people, which is why I spend a lot of my time not with people. And Emily's never ever triggered that, to be honest. So, which is good.
Yeah.
It comes from other people, I think, like feeling like inferior, feeling less than someone else, or feeling like I'm being humiliated or talked down to. That triggers me. But and I mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation, I mentioned about something called homicidal ideation, which it's the opposite of being suicidal. It makes you think harmful thoughts about harming other people, and that's something that developed very early on in my childhood. Like I was probably around 10, 11 years old when those thoughts came, and they were terrifying when I was a kid. But it also made me feel a sense of control over the situations that were happening. I think it's the way I sort of contextualize it now I'm older is that it made me feel in control in my head. Like when my dad was doing all those things, I thought to myself, basically, if I could kill him, it'd stop.
Yeah,
It'd
that's
stop.
interesting.
You know what I mean? And that carried over into my adulthood. You know, all these people would bully me and say things to me, and I just think, you know, if you weren't here anymore, you know, it wouldn't be so funny.
Yeah, makes sense.
It does make sense, but it really develops as I grew older into some really dark and horrible, heinous sort of thoughts and feelings. But it doesn't just come with thoughts; it comes with urges and with like the feelings, and it started to get extremely distressing. So the way I've dealt with it is I write. I have to get it out onto write. I have to write these things down, and I turned them into like stories, which Emily started to turn into short films, which is where Antisocial Theatre came along. So I don't know where I would be if I didn't find that outlet, if I'm completely honest.
That's yeah. I mean, in terms of managing anger now, you would say the number one thing is through writing and then creating videos, which is the antisocial theatre side of things. That's really the number one management.
I would say so. Like it's probably the one management system that I get the most from. Like I do the other things, like I got into like MMA and things like that, which has been really helpful.
That's helpful, yeah.
Yeah, but that doesn't quite scratch the itch, like mentally, as much as writing these things out, because you can't get, because you know another thing I want to highlight on this topic is throughout the mental health journey, that speaking to different people and seeing things like depression and anxiety are thankfully spoken about a lot more, which is great. And people speak a lot about like suicide, especially with men and things like that. But one thing that gets very swept under the carpet in mental health is the other side. You know, what if I didn't feel suicidal? What if I felt like the other way? What if I felt like killing everybody?
Yeah.
Like, who do I go to? Who do I talk to without being judged? Because, you know, it's. I think it's a pretty normal feeling. Like in terms of the human experience, we've all felt something similar. It's just that I think it probably more than the average person should. But I don't think I should be vilified just for thinking those things, because I've obviously never done them because I'm sat here talking. But I just think I have to, and with my writing as well, there's no sort of limit. Like I can be as heinous as I want, because it's, as long as obviously I put it into like a story format.
Paper, it's not real, is it? So yeah.
And it is a story as well. It's not just me rambling like things. That I actually put it into a coherent narrative, and people really like it. I get a lot of messages. People say they love it, so it's obviously doing something for other people.
That's amazing. Another quick question before we move on to learning a little bit more about antisocial theatre was personal questions, so you don't have to answer, but how was your relationship with your parents? Like, what is that like now? Because obviously, I mean, your dad abused you, and your mum seems like you speak to her now, but you were kicked out at a fairly young age.
Yeah. So yeah, that's fine. So basically, so my dad, obviously, he was in jail for 8 years for we actually found out he was a sex offender as well. On top of everything else that he'd done, he was also a paedophile as well. So yeah, I haven't seen him since the court case, God knows how many years ago. My stepdad, who we moved in with, he at the time was struggling with some things as well, like alcohol and stuff, which manifested for more trauma for me. We hated each other basically, and it didn't go so well, which is the reason I got kicked out. And I always held some animosity towards my mother because of that. But I feel like you let that happen to me twice now. You've but obviously growing up, she's a woman, and he's this big strong guy. Like what could she have done? Obviously I know that growing up, but I do think I harbour that sort of I will never forgive thing because I didn't have to be chucked out. Like, she could have left him, and she did leave him. She did leave him at one point, but she brought me back to him. So I just thought, you've got rid of him. You've took me away from him because you thought it was like to keep me safe. But you've then put me back in that situation, and I can't afford to move out now. So I've got to stay with him. So I think I've always held that rage and sort of.
So it's totally understandable.
Yeah.
Why you would feel like that.
I do speak to her. We have a much better relationship now, don't we? We talk. I'm going to see her next weekend, actually. So we do have some sort of a relationship. But there is always that sort of underlying, like I have to
Resentment
try
almost.
when I'm there. Yeah, like when I'm
Yeah.
there, I have to try really hard not to say something.
Yeah. Yeah, which is normal. And for you, the most difficult part is it's your mom. So you want to have a relationship with her because she's your mom, but
Yeah.
equally, and the thing with parenthood is that they're trying to do the best with the tools that they have, and they don't realize the effect that that then has on you as a child in that really important like period of development. I mean, abuse in childhood is like one of the biggest causes of mental health issues from childhood into adulthood.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I guess your mum just probably turned a blind eye to it because she loved your dad, probably the same with the stepdad situation, I don't know, and ignored it. And then it's obviously, and now you're having to deal with all of those things as an adult. So it's understandable.
I mean, and obviously for anyone listening as well, like I am aware that people in abuse settings, it isn't easy to just run away. It isn't easy to just go, and that's the reason she may have gone back as well, out of fear. And obviously, people who do those kinds of things are usually very good at manipulating their way back into the situation.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah.
but when you're a kid and you're developing, you don't get that. You don't contextualize that, and by that point, the damage in your brain has already been done.
Yeah,
Quite hard to sort of change your mindset on that. Which I've done a lot of work. Like if we had this conversation a few years ago, there'd have been a lot more aggression coming out of my voice. But I've done a lot of work over the years to try and understand people a little bit more because, quite frankly, I've had to learn emotions from other people. Like when in social settings, people like me, I've had to learn what to say, how to say things, how to stand, how to, I need to smile at this point or else I'll come across this way. Like it's really hard. Because
hard.
otherwise I'd just be like I just wouldn't have any emotion. Because
Is that something that's been done through just your own education or therapy? Learning how things like body language and how to behave in those certain settings. How have you learned those things?
Probably just through like education, but it's more of a subconscious thing. Like people with ASPD and many other PDs actually it's called masking. A lot of people talk about it in loads of other different mental health disorders and things like that. But masking is essentially one of the biggest things that people with ASPD do, and it's essentially, funnily enough, why it's not why I got into acting, but it helps, and it's essentially you have to pretend everything is normal, whatever that is. Like so you naturally pick up how people talk, how people recall things, how people engage with other people. Because one thing I still really struggle with to this day is to connect to another human being, and have like a conversation about something that isn't about something like this. Like if I went out into a social situation and I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol, I would find it very hard to talk to that person, and that's just because I've not really ever learned how to do it. You know what I mean? So bits and bobs I've learned, obviously.
You're very good now. You're a natural at this.
This is a topic I know a lot about. That's probably why.
Yeah, I guess if you went through a lot of your life not having friends and not having that communication with your parents, you just don't learn how to communicate, do you? So I can't imagine as an adult how, and that's so. I mean, this question might move nicely onto the antisocial theatre because obviously communication is a huge part of like gaining a job or a career and being in a career setting. So how has that affected you there, or are you a full-time actor? Like, what do you do?
So in terms of my job, like I've experienced a lot of job loss over the years. Because of this, because of the irritability and the anger, and because I just don't care a lot of the time. And like I come from the only sort of job you can get into, with my history, between the ages of 16 to 19, that's pretty much when you start developing skills to try and get a job, and you go to college and university. obviously that's when it was worse for me. So I didn't really develop those skills at the time. So the only jobs I've been able to get into is like low level, like call center jobs, which is what from 16 onwards, I was in and out of those jobs all the time because anyone who's listening to this who doesn't have ASPD will know how like angry those jobs make you anyway. But
Yeah.
for me particularly, I could not last in those jobs, and there's loads of times where I've left jobs and I've had no money and I've had to be on the benefit system many times. But now I work in like it's like more of an admin position, so I don't talk to customers. It's just I don't talk to my colleagues. I work from home. I do my admin. I barely speak to people. I go home. It's great. I don't really speak to people. But with Antisocial Theatre, I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't be able to do it if I couldn't communicate in some sort of way. But most of the content that we've produced thus far is either in the style of short films, so that's sort of my writing doing the talking, or educational posts that people just sort of read. But funnily enough, we're branching out into the face-to-face, face-to-camera sort of stuff. And I think things like this, like the podcast, helps me do that. It helps me sort of talk, because you'll notice that in my writing, I'm very clear and coherent about what I'm saying. This is this means this is what the result is. But when I'm talking, I trip up a lot and I can't think properly. So this helps me build that.
No, I think, in all honesty, I think you're amazing, and both of you are amazing. But you haven't come across in any way like you're tripping up throughout this podcast.
That's good.
So, which is great. Obviously, it must be working the other podcasts that you've done.
Yeah.
So Antisocial Theatre, obviously you've explained a little bit about what it is, but have you got like an overall mission or goal with the page?
Yeah. So I would say, in brief, would be to help sort of destigmatize controversial mental health topics, essentially. And to sort of de-vilify people with typically sensationalized mental health disorders. So, for example, ASPD, again, very point. You mentioned narcissism at the beginning. So that term is thrown around just because somebody doesn't like somebody, or and narcissism refers to NPD, or narcissistic personality disorder. So, and people throw the term sociopath around and psychopath. Those are, none of those are the same things, by the way. Those are completely separate things. And I think the goal is to help tell not just my story and Emily's story, but also other people's stories who suffer with other disorders.
Through film, is that what you're trying? Would it be through film? Is that really like the end goal?
Well, that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
It originally started as theatre productions, but I think we mentioned this in a video a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
During lockdown, because of the pandemic, we sort of had to go digital, and that's where we got the idea. So you do the monologues and write them, and then I create them into short films, and we find they're quite easily like digested, I suppose, when people look at them through that. But now we've branched onto TikTok and we're doing the face-to-face things. That's also what we do.
I think people have more of a sort of an emotional experience to things like music, poetry, art in general. Like, we all listen to music, and when we hear our favourite lyrics, we get that little tingle and things like that. But when somebody talks with words, it as in like describes the situation that they're going through, it's hit. But when you see it in, like, when you watch a film, for example, like if I told you, like, the people who listen to this, they might hear the story about my abuse, for example, and think, oh, that's sad, but it doesn't really go past that. But if you watch the film about it, and you've got all the sounds and the sights, and you can see, feel, hear what's going on in this person's house or in this person's life, then it hits home. So it's a completely different experience. It's an immersive experience that you don't get when someone's just writing down their experiences on paper. I think it's a completely different experience.
That's incredible. And you both work on this together outside of your full-time jobs?
Yeah.
Is that stressful? Or do you just...
It's stressful. I think it's just when you've been working like 40 hours a week, and then you want to put the effort into this, but you might not have the time. But obviously it's like a passion of ours, so we do
and
we do enjoy it.
we would love to do something like this full time.
I
Like,
was going to say, how do you think you could make this a full-time job, or is that still where you're trying to like find out how to monetize it?
yeah, I mean, we've had a conversation with a couple of people. There's actually some guy who you may or may not have seen on TikTok called Simon Squibb. He's like a millionaire, and he stops people in the street and says, would you start a business? I don't know if you've ever seen it, but he runs like an online thing called Help Bank, and it's where loads of people help people to start businesses. Anybody, like, people can help them get into that industry. And I went on it actually and explained the idea and said, has anyone got any idea how we could make this into like a way of life, basically? And loads of people commented and just said, obviously you can team up with other mental health foundations and do like events and that kind of stuff. Or
that'd be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you can do YouTube, you can do TikTok.
Yeah,
public speaking. There's someone called, I think her name is Ellie Mids. She calls herself on LinkedIn, but I think it's Ellie Middleton. She speaks about ADHD and autism. And her full-time income, which she's talked about publicly online, is literally public speaking. She writes. I think she's written a book and done some other stuff now, but it just started by talking about her experience, which is basically what we're doing. So maybe one day something will happen.
Well, I hope so, because you're both great people and
Thank you.
Incredible stories. So maybe you could write a joint book together.
Thought about writing a book.
Yeah,
that'd be interesting. I think it's really interesting, and it's really important to come on as a couple and do this, because a lot of people will come on their own and like navigate. So many people have mental health issues, so the likelihood of you being in a relationship with someone who has suffered something in their life or who suffers with a mental health issue today is way more likely than it is unlikely.
Absolutely.
So being able to come on here and talk about, yes, we both have these very different mental health issues, but we've navigated our relationship and we're still together now after how many years?
That's about 3
years.
About 3 years now.
3 years, and you're also using your experiences to help other people and build something incredible. So I think that's also a really important message from this podcast. But before we get to the end, one of the questions that I always like to ask, but I'll ask you both in the same question, but answer individually, is if there is somebody listening to this right now who is really struggling with a mental health issue, maybe one that we've spoken about today, or maybe one that we haven't, what is the number one piece of advice that you would give them?
For me, I would say specifically anybody suffering with a controversial personality disorder, a cluster B personality disorder. Just because you hold that disorder, it doesn't make you a monster. It doesn't mean that you're destined to be in prison. It doesn't mean that you're an evil person. And just because you suffer with low empathy, that doesn't equate to monstrous behaviour. And it doesn't mean you can't be compassionate to other people as well. So that would be my message.
And I would probably say, like, in the aspect of OCD, to anyone that is struggling with it, I know how scary it is and how tormenting it is towards you, and it makes you think some really awful things that you wouldn't ever imagine you could think. But no matter what you are thinking, there is someone else out there that is going through the exact same thing and that's had the exact same thing before. And if you want to reach out for help, you can do that, and there are places that will support you, and people that will support you as well. It's, even though the disorder's not really spoken about enough in terms of what it actually is, a lot of people do suffer with it, and there is help out there that people can, obviously, you can go to people and talk about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, both of you. And in terms of OCD, that there is OCD information, education, all that sort of stuff on the Antisocial Theatre page. Is that right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, if anybody is listening, remember to go to Antisocial Theatre. I'll leave a link to your, is it just Instagram, or do you have anything else that, obviously the TikTok, have you got a website or anything?
We're in the process of updating the website, but we have just started a LinkedIn where we're going to start putting the more like professional things that we've been doing on there.
Yeah, we've got YouTube and TikTok as well.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'll leave all the links in the description for this podcast, so anyone listening can go and check out the page. I've had a look myself, and it's incredible. And you've got an amazing engagement. So I really do hope that blows up and maybe becomes a business one day. But thank you so much both for being on here. It's been so nice to speak to you, and hopefully we can work together in the future one day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode today. I hope this episode has resonated with you and offered insights, comfort, and most importantly, the knowledge that you are not alone. Remember, your mental health journey is unique just like you are. It's okay to have good days and bad days, and it's okay to seek help and support when you need it. You are strong, resilient, and capable of navigating life's challenges. If you found value in today's episode, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this podcast with someone who might benefit from it. And if you'd like to hear more about specific topics or have any questions, please leave a comment below. We're here to support and empower each other. Together, we can break the stigma surrounding mental health and create a more compassionate and understanding world. If you haven't already, please do check out our Facebook community group, which is a non-judgmental space for you guys to share your stories, experiences, and support each other. As we close the episode, please do remember to take a moment for some self-care, whether it's a deep breath, a walk in nature, or a simple act of kindness to yourself. Remember to nurture your mental well-being after these conversations. Thank you so much for being part of our community. I appreciate you all so much. And also, if you are listening and feel like you could have a story to share, please do drop me a Instagram message, email me at info@vitamindose.co, or you can also go to the website and fill in a form at www.vitamindose.co. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.